It is important to understand that the suppression of evidence ought always to be taken for the strongest evidence, and that no power should be exercised but such as is expressly given, and therefore no constructive power can be exercised to prevent this is the great use of the Bill of Rights. The reading of all good books is like a conversation with the finest minds in the past century. Falling down is not a failure. Failure comes when you stay where you have fallen. I hope that real love and truth are stronger in the end than any evil or misfortune in the world. If you're not willing to learn, no one can help you. If you are determined to learn, no one can stop you. The world is changed by your example, not your opinion. The only true wisdom is knowing you know nothing. If you want to overcome the whole world, overcome yourself. You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending. Your knowledge is far more important than your degree. We are no longer accepting the things we cannot change. It is now time to change the things we cannot accept. Be tolerant with others and strict with yourself. Remember, it is not the job itself that brings fulfillment, but our own mindset and attitude towards it. Find contentment and purpose in your work, no matter how menial it may seem. To be trusted is a greater compliment than being loved. Thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge. A sign of intelligence is an awareness of one's own ignorance. When the American spirit was in its youth, the language of America was different. Liberty, sir, was then the primary object. Conquer yourself rather than the world. Death begins a wicked man's hell. Death ends a godly man's hell. A free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature, and not as the gift of their chief magistrates. The simple step of a courageous individual is not to take part in the lie. All acts of the legislator, apparently contrary to natural rights and justice, are void. The society that separates its scholars from its warriors will have its thinking done by cowards and its frightening by fools. Let's try that again. The society that separates its scholars from its warriors will have thinking done by cowards and its fighting by fools. Make yourself sheep, and the wolves will eat you. You can't truly call yourself peaceful unless you're capable of great violence. If you're not capable of violence, you're not peaceful, you're harmless. Important distinction. Wisdom is to consider things according to their own proof. A dreamer is one who can only find his way by moonlight, and his punishment is that he sees the dawn before the rest of the world. Prior to capitalism, the way people amassed great wealth was by looting, plundering, enslaving their fellow man. Capitalism made it possible to become wealthy by serving your fellow man. If you quietly bend your neck to that yoke, you prove yourself ready to receive any bondage to which your lords and masters shall please to subject you. I glory in publicly avowing my eternal enmity to tyranny. Enter their minds, and you'll find the judges you're so afraid of, and how judiciously they judge themselves. I cannot escape death, but I can escape fear of it. The Confederate insurrectionists conducting lawfare for insurrection against the United States are using the various magic spells and fraudulent schemes that they have collected from researching around the world and other locations, schemes, and frauds, manifesting the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, which is a part of that magic spell, which generates the pretense of the terror factory to collect Jews, to entrap them and ensnare them and subvert them and break them according to their own interests. And then, like the KKK who acquired the Jews in order to harass and break blacks and other minorities, would be turned on and broken on maturity when they, becoming eradicated from no longer being useful, only had a brief respite, and then the permanent intoxication of the hell of opposition of precedent, which they themselves have bound themselves to, in joining the very crimes committed against them. And this realization understands that their cowardice and weakness and kowtowing is self-destructive and subversive. And that same function in the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, being manifest, includes the rich and the famous, and thus those who are rich because they are famous, generates the assumption that they, in their elite functions, can survive or weather the storm of the communism coming for them, is ignorance on its face. And when they are no longer useful as propagandists, they will be turned on and destroyed and dismantled. At which point, the Chinese Revolution stole the land from the landowners, even if the landowner was good to its tenants, because the existence of wealth, the existence of having tenants, the existence of having the influence in the first place generates their inferiority, and thus the contempt and hatred. And in this action, they become targets of harassment and brutalizations, which in many cases they would have approved of. And their attempt to use the devil's function of escaping by karma only applies if their victims are the ones making the judgment. And their victims are not the ones making the judgment because the victims are the ones that are essential to the structure of society. And thus they would be broken. And thus the ones that they would be judged by are the communist extremists who will no longer need radicals who are dumb enough to have supported them, and in that action understand that their sentence was verified the moment they proved that they were a coward to be kowtowed and subjugated, and thus inferior in the hierarchy, and thus the subject of having supported the communism is the subject of their great torments and horrors, which they have befalled upon themselves. The insurrectionist extremists enjoy the privileges of the side effects of the associations with the rich and the famous and the other targets who are being captured as essential functions for their propaganda. But in the end, they will be gutted. And the function is that they don't actually care in any way whatsoever about them, and would turn on them at the slightest turn of a hat, as they are arbitrary, irrational insurrections, they, being a wild dog with rabies, will bite at anything in order to break its bones and to eat its meat. And the function of the consumption is the core tenet of the psychopaths, who trade people and not money, and the function of capturing targets so that they can rob the targets is to them an infinite money glitch, and thus those who have more money become the targets of the glitch, and those who given away their money become the target of the glitch, and those that do not have any money become the target of the glitch, as it is not based upon any particular strategy. It is not based on the intent to acquire an objective. It is irrational compulsion by the insane, by the sociopathic, to have conducted the injury. They don't care about the money, which arbitrarily changes things that require too much attention for them who were never going to spend the time in order to have done so, which may have landed them somewhere in the free market, allowing them to ignore the rest of their horseshit. Whereas they, being too incompetent to have existed in that system, have rejected it for their incompetence, have embraced their stupidity, and have engorged themselves on the benefits of the temporary high of the drugs and addictions derived in the black market. And the function of conducting those highs in the black market includes the satisfaction derived by its abuse for the sake of its abuse, which becomes self-compounding on its interest. And being addicted to the abuse can only increase the severity of that abuse in order to satisfy or catch up with the high, which exponentially compounds on itself as the core nature of anyone who would have supported them, such as their expression in the War on David. Thus, the position of their fraudulent policy in 1983, when the Nazis, having overthrown the United States government, compelled the judicial activism position that the militia loyal to the Confederates can conduct any abuse against the Constitution, at which points the expression of that infatuation with the abuse, including the function of the accelerants of their child predators, went to Epstein and accelerated past Jeffrey Epstein, which was an intelligence asset, and thus Jeffrey Epstein saying to himself that he wants to be considered a good man, said that he can be a part of it and then maintain his integrity by establishing the limits. And having told them that there are limits, acquire their spite and hatred, qualifying their retaliation and eventual assassination, and the entire mess, including the function of turning off his camera in order to guarantee that there wouldn't be evidence of their crime. And at this point, prison becomes the most unsafe place that could be possibly imagined. The more secure you are by those who want to kill you, the less safe you can possibly be, and thus in that action have expressed the position of those who have deluded themselves to Jeffrey Epstein's incompetence in thinking that the insanity can be controlled. It cannot. Their entire purpose of the Confederate insurrection is to remove the bondage of law, for their worship of Satan is liberty from God. Again, the expression comes from those who have studied magic historically, and thus the position of those in the Soviet Union who had the light blue helmets expressly conducted the malicious rape culture being reproduced inside the United States by the white supremacist Confederacy, who also have their own type of communism, which is against the other communisms as its core identity is the white supremacy, and thus the position of the white supremacists predetermining their accelerants have expressed themselves as being exempt on the basis of status. The hierarchy states that they get to treat you differently and with contempt because of their status and the wealth which they gave themselves by robbery, and thus the advantage of communism. And thus, in that materialization of their abuse structures, is self-delulu, and in the expression of their delulu, they have manifest these spells and thus returning to the Soviet Union concerning their version of the Gestapo, concerning their version of whatever the fuck secret system they're doing with the surveillance program and fraudulent contracts, expresses the rape culture, and thus the threat of the war seeking collateral damage and arbitrary threats. The position is expressly simply that a spell exists. Someone makes an accusation against you, and the spell has manifest. Similar to in the war in the Middle East, where they got informants who would arbitrarily make accusations against their competitors and their neighbors and their arbitrary local nonsense. And the position is expressly that those powers seeking the eradication of their society by the white supremacists, who being white supremacists hurt them, want to hurt all of them, and thus the false accusation is irrelevant so long as it exists, and thus the creation and the manifestation of the warlocks and the witches. And the warlocks and the witches arbitrarily seeming the imbuement of power has done so from the power of the devil, and the devil seeking the destruction requests the knowledge of which target to go after and consume and break in a particular way. And this expression being understood fundamentally includes the position of the arbitrary interest of the rape culture, which generates the threats to a man who's married or has a girlfriend to let the wizard have sex with the significant other. And if he rejects them, then he shall be punished severely and possibly killed. And if the wife does not consent as well, then her husband will be harassed and brutalized and possibly killed. And in this expression, that they understand that once the accusation comes to them, the wizards themselves, the enforcers themselves, that there is no purpose in arguing, as there was never a basis in reality, merely the arbitrary expression of that rabies-bitten dog and his service to the devil. Thus, the expression of their involvement into the neuroscience and other expressions of secret sciences which they effectively generates the argument that they have conducted a Roofies Plus system by the surveillance systems, actively conducting experiments and non-experiments. Thus, the position of them putting roofies in someone's drink, they know what's going to happen when they put the roofies in. They know the result of their action. It's a tool of their militia to express their various interests for their spells to be enforced, and thus in that action have engaged in those arbitrary functions of the rape culture, such as the surveillance agents who harass people who they want to date or stalk their exes, including each other, and thus in that action of the arbitrary use of government equipment for their individual actions falsely have the protection of the government, which doesn't have the authority to provide them the immunity, as their action is not service of law and thus disconnected from the government of law. And in this expression, you have manifest the express reproductive position of Plato's conspiracy of the centralized planning of the sexual market for communism. And in that communism, have determined the false feminist position of expressing the hypersexuality of women according to the rape contracts to be distributed as prostitutes, and thus do not have to be acknowledged or respected in any way, shape, or form. As the expression comes into its maturity, it becomes expressly more abusive, compounding on itself infinitely, and thus the position of the abuse accelerates according to the staged plans, which on maturity will return to Confederate historic quote unquote positions. And that includes the position of them to be seen and not to be heard, and to be expressly distributed according to their interest, and thus they being a little bit higher than the slaves cannot actually be acknowledged for any particular interest, and thus their full collapse in the system is the complete ignoring of them in that system, and thus the returning to everything that the Confederates and others have expressed through their propaganda systems, such as the position that when they're being raped, they're to sit back and enjoy it, and that they had to have enjoyed it because they got pregnant, because any girl who has sex can't get pregnant unless they enjoyed it, and thus these self-compounding delusions from the big lies will then turn on the women, and thus the position of many of the women who have supported the insurrection's frauds as witches have expressed themselves into the bondage of the historic position of those who have claimed similar positions in order to have acquired the attention. And thus, the women who supported voter rights from the beginning did so for themselves as a collective unit, not for other groups. Thus, the precedent of voter rights was ignored in favor of women's voter rights. The sacrifice that the Jews made when cooperating with the KKK to attack another group is the same thing that the delusional women made with the same devils, expressing to the position that they should have voter rights and others should not have voter rights, as the influence of women is derived by their economic standing and their ability to sustain a political position, which can be collapsed by the communism, as women, being the weaker sex, can easily be overpowered and conducted in this position, hyper accelerating the already highly populated position of domestic abusers inside the Confederacy, which has infiltrated many aspects of the government, including the police departments, which have a certain number of domestic abusers. And in this expression, their subjugation, not dissimilar to the other abuses to the other political identities, would then be expressed against them, and thus the full muting of women in a complete permanent trap where they have sold not only themselves, but their posterity in its entirety to this abuse, and thus America no longer being able to protect them means there is no more safe haven to run to. There is no resurrection of the thing. The position expressly dedicates itself to the harsh destruction of the entire world by the formation of revelation. And in that expression, those quote unquote men or man-childs would have destroyed the world. And in that expression of their ability to control the narrative at the expense of reality, they would have conducted every kind of arbitrary interest of abuse by their sorceries and their frauds, and in that activity compound exponentially the horrors of anyone who would have supported them, as the deal with the devil is self-destruction. There is an addiction, and everyone who is consuming products which are addictive believe that they are the exception until they have been consumed by it and become bonded by that addiction, and in this expression become slaves to the devils they made that deal with, and then express themselves to the horrors and the devastations to the ecosystem, social, economic, and others. At which point, the complete collapse of that system becomes incapable of being resurrected unless by an act of God, which requires the full breaking and eradication and punishment of that delusional psychopathic society which tolerated its existence, allowing it to manifest any controls. You must understand that every lie we tell, there is a debt accrued, and sooner or later the debts must be paid. Now they say from the wizard's spell that all cops are bastards, and by the definition prescribed, Confederates on patrol are all bastards. There are no good white supremacists. The kind of people who want J. Sekulo's Civil War, where he actively accepts collateral damage as a reasonable outcome, actively engages in the function of unreasonable engagements or force in order to do political violence for systemic hate crime by said hate group, which is the KKK, which have infiltrated the government, engaging in these terrorist operations. At which point, the endorsement of the violence is the validation of the protocols of Learned Elder Zion of creating a false morality in order to justify violence, in order to capture the society by which it is systematically destroyed by these fraudulent engagements, as the total structure is trapped and seized and then collapsed by an inferior super minority against the super minority, and then up to the super majority, at which point these super predators engage in their violent insurrections and various frauds by the basis of the schemes according to the protocols. At which point the politicians which view themselves as gaining an advantage in the political violence have eaten the fruit of the poison tree and have entered a arena of lawlessness, which is political violence, which means they cannot use the rule of law in order to defend themselves against the precedent of their political violence. And so when the other Confederate factions turn on them and start destroying them, they don't actually have a legal or competent argument against that criminal act, which they viewed as legal according to the Confederacy by the mixing of jurisdictions under these fraudulent engagements. Now, their political violence has targeted David under the pretense of those hate crime functions, and the arguments systematically relying on, without their defamation, the preservation of his and the United States and other sovereignties, as David is a nation with a treaty with the United States under the obstructed contract schedule. He is a material sovereign. A constitutional king is a material sovereign with his own jurisdiction, not to be subordinated to any other jurisdiction according to the agreement, which does not give permission to the insurrectionist position, which acts arbitrarily outside of hierarchy, as they are a chaotic evil arrangement. And the United States, with that treaty in a mutual defense arrangement, have to protect the rights in the United States of David as a foreign sovereign and as an American individual at the same time, mixing the two. And the function of that arrangement constitutes the repelling of the argument to justify the surveillance harassment and its subversions, attacking fundamental aspects such as the contract schedule, so that various targets victimized by the hate group can be humiliated and basically have a glorified bell tied around their neck, demonstrating the outsiderness qualities of whoever it is as a side effect of the harassment, as they're assaulted and generates the reactions, is then demonstrated in the negative aspect as POWs for humiliation. And the POWs held for humiliation are actively contracted arbitrarily off of the black market, but more directly as a direct reaction to who they were in the legal structure according to the Confederate estimates, stealing the American intelligence structure in order to know who they are attacking and how much they are reducing, and thus they create a mirror. And thus, the less they have to say about it during the humiliation, the more arbitrary it becomes, and the more even keel it becomes into an underlying nuisance. At which point, the more important they are, the more aggressive towards the negative they pull, and thus those pulled to the lower levels substantively from the first level of investigation would have been at the higher stakes, and thus those who are more important are reduced with greater weight, and thus the public not being able to see them in the correct context only observe out of context additional weights and harassments, which generates the pretense of not taking them seriously. It's important to consider the fact that the Fresu function is founded on deceit. And thus, how do you get complete opposites to agree in unison concerning a single action? You lie to all of them concerning different units, and thus the function becomes an alignment from misdirection. At which point, according to the D&D lore, amongst others, the demon lord would find good aligned people as a preference in order to systematically make them choose to do evil that seems good, and then pulls them in slowly as they become ensnared into the trap and then sacrifice themselves, at which point they're given a false heaven until the illusion is dissolved and they become consumed by the demon lord. And in that action becomes the realization of the purpose of these terrorist operations and programs in the service of evil, chaotic, elemental evil. And the proof is in the pudding for the arrangements. Take, for instance, the arrangements of the Protocols of the Learner of Zion, which dictates the policy to subvert them by a distraction morality to justify criminal excesses to a legal limitation in the Constitution and others. And in that function, you systematically have it break down. Now, do you start off telling them the most direct thing? No, you create a degree of occult knowledge and then you build more degrees of that occult knowledge. Thus, the function of outright loyalty to arbitrary evil isn't going to be the selling point. They're going to pretend that there are redeeming good qualities, that you're doing something good, that you can really affect the world in a positive way in order to sucker in those with a low wisdom into extraordinary evil, which they cannot escape and must consistently reinforce, amassing the debts to society, such as the position of the creation of a druidic cult amongst religious leaders who would then systematically be pulled into the Mormon Satanism, and thus the function of using violence or hate crimes to compel morality according to Satan's religion becomes the position. At which point, those who are in the church are then actively functioning against God as an enemy combatant to God Himself, similar to in the Deep South for the Confederates and after the Civil War with the KKK, actively had pastors in the KKK reinforcing all kinds of arbitrary abuses, such as their murder of black children. And it is 100% completely vindicated to those degenerate psychopaths who, under no circumstance, would ever use the Bible as anything but a paperweight. As you can shake it all you want and show it all you want, the function is that the information in the Bible is their enemy. The closer you are to danger, the further you are from harm, and thus the closer those who worship Satan are to the Bible, the less danger they are for receiving active subversions by those who follow God, and thus the traps begin to be set inside God's house until it becomes a barren box. And to pursue it to this end, it is essential to observe the quote unquote scientific roots of the progressive tyranny such as from Glenn Beck's history pilot, Control Freaks, at which point it goes on the express position of the public version of the secret society of the KKK and its Confederate observations in a particular faction of it. And the function of tracking where the history starts with David, you have to go to the secret societies in what has been published in order to understand when they started reacting to the concept of David, which was observed through astrology. At which point, the function of having attacked David before he was born indicates that the justification is not a reaction to the person, as an infant has done nothing. And the function of having attacked his dad before he was born but indicates the function that it had nothing to do with that either. And thus the arrangements systematically compound on themselves, such as the FBI's position with James Comey's report on their investigation establishes the function that David was targeted by the uh, breeding programs, which generates the pretense of the histrionic position of creating the Paul Atreides from the Dune series, mixing the extraordinary wealth and power of a noble house with extraordinary magical powers from the priests or the druids. I'm spacing on exactly what you call them. There it is. It's the Ben Gesserit. At which point, the combination of all of the Bene Gesserits having concentrated those political powers and other powers culminates in the rejection of the established predicted line into the unpredicted line. In the story of Dune, it's women compounding the magical system for exponential increase in their ability to influence the magic into a male. At which point it would, by definition, be something along these lines, except according to the record, there's an indication that it's not about sex, but about family trees, and thus the culmination of the family tree was supposed to defect to somebody else, but then the reaction reconcentrated it towards the astrology position, creating the superpower embodiment, which generates the pretense of a world power. As a first world power, this engagement, having been targeted, has been killed, and thus the ability for the Satanists to resurrect it at the correct time creates a little horn, which has been resurrected as though from dead. It behooves me to clarify that the Mormon Satan in the Mormon religion is brothers with Jesus. And thus, Jesus' argument is that people should have free will in order to do good and evil. And the Mormon Satan states that humanity has to be captured, coerced, and corralled and coddled into the function, infantilizing them, turning them into glorified cattle, into positive morality by the violence and harassment campaigns. At which point, this is the foundational definition, which will be exponentially more complicated than this when you research it, as it is an entire series of literature, which I'm not specifically going to express in this video. If you make deals with the devil or one of his servants, you will make yourself sheep and will be devoured by the wolves, by the various traps inside of the small print.